maybe in your experience, what do you think is important for children to know when they're trying to make decisions or to use good judgment?
I think it's really important for children to have a sense of an inner healer or an inner guide or an inner friend who understands their troubles and who loves them no matter what. I think that provides them with a foundation that is portable, that can go with them, and that in spite of what parents or teachers or what anybody else around them does, they can still have a sense of their own power and safety.
That's excellent. How do you think they would learn about this wounded healer? How would they get that?
Well, I think somebody would have to tell them, and maybe illustrate it with a little story or something like that.
Okay, so maybe that in fact we can actually teach it.
Oh, why not? Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Like if I were someone's grandma, I could say, well, what Grandma used to do when she was a little girl was I used to imagine that there was somebody inside me who cared for me very, very much, and who never criticized me, and whose face lit up every time I came to see her.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Welcome back to Bay Area Psychology. When we left, we were talking about children from at different ages, and I wondered when our speaker in the video was talking about sort of an inner voice, I had in mind a younger child for some reason, and I'm wondering if you have any comments about what she had to say.
Well, I thought she said something that was very interesting, and that is that basically if we communicate to a child that we have faith in his or her judgment and affirm the child when the child is making good judgment, and communicate to the child that it's really critical that he or she like herself, then I think the child is more predisposed to making wise decisions. I mean, what we're really talking about is cause and effect. And if you ask me, what's the essence of this problem that this whole book addresses, I think the essence is that there are children who have a very marginal appreciation for cause and effect. If they do this, there are consequences. I grew up and went to college in the 60s and the 70s, and the malaise of my generation was that we were so future-oriented that we didn't live in the present. And so the whole Haight-Ashbury movement was really an attempt by the part of young people, on the part of young people, to say we must live in the present, we must seize the moment. And so we went to Esalen and we did all sorts of encounter groups because we were trying to change our orientation from living so much in the future so that we were making decisions and reveling in the present. And now what I think has happened is the pendulum has swung the other way. And I think that kids are so present time oriented that many of them are making flawed judgments, and they're not thinking in terms of what are the consequences down the road. What are the consequences of graduating with a 1.9 GPA? What are the consequences of getting arrested? What are the consequences of perhaps being crippled or shot because I happen to go into an area where there's a very high incidence of crime or gang violence? Those are the kinds of issues that I'm concerned about.
And it is, you're right, I mean, it is an orientation in thinking. I remember my parents' argument for doing well in school was, of course, going to college, which wasn't an option. And the reason we needed to go to college was to have something to, quote, fall back on or have options in the future. Mm-hmm. And so it was sort of seen as kind of a tool to put in your tool bag, to have some sort of degree or some sort of training, so that no matter what you decided to do in your life, there would be something there for you. And so what was interesting about that is there was never a focus on, are you enjoying what you're learning? Mm-hmm. But there was very much a goal-directed purpose for doing so.
I think it's possible to balance. And I just want to return for a second to the point I was making. I have a little boy who's 1 year old.
Yes.
I imagine 5, 6 years, it's conceivable that he and a friend could be standing on the side of a stream, throwing rocks in the stream, and let's assume that it had rained for the previous 6 days, and let's assume that that stream is moving very, very quickly. And his buddy says, let's see if we can walk across the rocks to the other side of the stream. I'm hoping, I have no guarantees, but I'm hoping that if there is a great deal of danger in that particular situation, I'm hoping that my son would look at that and say no. And I'm hoping that even if they say, you're a chicken, or you're a scaredy cat, why don't you do this, that he will have enough self-confidence in his own judgment that he would say no. Now, I know he's going to make mistakes. I know he's going to suffer defeats in life. What I'm concerned about is how does he respond to those mistakes and those setbacks? How does he learn from them? And at those very, very critical junctures where his life might be at risk, is he strong enough? Does he have enough self-esteem and enough self-confidence to make the right choice? I can't always be there.
And to be his own advocate.
That's right.
Let's take a look at the next couple of areas you address in your book. Planning ahead. Establishing motivational goals, establish priorities, develop success-oriented strategies, and thinking smart. Use available resources efficiently, manage time, learn from mistakes, bounce back from setbacks, and neutralize obstacles. So in terms of planning ahead and having motivational goals, I mean, how do we teach a child? Well, I guess a part of it is learning with the child what actually motivates them, I imagine.
What he enjoys. And let's say the child says to you, well, I enjoy baseball, or I enjoy ballet, or I enjoy gymnastics. Encouraging the child to establish some personal goals, short-term goals, long-term goals, to discuss with the child, well, where do you think you'd like to be a year from now in your gymnastics? Would you like to would you like to have the ability to do this routine or that routine? Would you like to go to the next level of competition? At the same time, it's very important that we don't impose our own agendas on the child. I had a situation not too long ago where a parent came into me and was very distressed. Daughter went to a private school, was struggling, and I looked at certain issues involving the child's capabilities and what have you, and I said, you know, we just really need to do some more assessment and see what this child is capable of doing. I said, I believe that children should be encouraged to stretch and to reach. On the other hand, I think sometimes we may impose our needs on the child, and the child is stretching and reaching for things that are not compatible with his or her abilities. And I said, you know, my wife is a psychologist with a PhD. I went to Stanford. If my son says to me, and my son is adopted, so I don't have any genetic input. I think he's a very precocious child. I said, if my son says to me that I want to be a mechanic or I want to be a gardener, I don't care. I just want him to feel pride in what he does, and I would like him to be a good gardener or a good mechanic. And I said, if your daughter expresses interest in becoming a cosmetologist or working at Macy's in the cosmetics department, there's nothing inherently wrong with that if that's what she wants. And the mother said, I would never let my child become work for Macy's as a cosmetologist or in the cosmetics department. I said, well, you really need to take a look at that. Well, she got furious at me. And so what I'm saying to you is I think it's important to help kids understand what they need to do to get from point A to point B to point C. I think in some cases it may be okay to impose some standards and saying, for example, in our home, I don't care what your grades are, but you certainly have to try. I have to feel that you're doing your best. That's all I care about. And if I feel that you're coasting, then I'm going to get on your case about it. But at the same time, I think we need to be realistic.
Well, I think you're making an important point, because so much of what we do, ask, and expect of our children is through our own filter. You know, and in the case you cited, I mean, this whole idea of I have a preconceived picture about what I want other people to be. And letting go of that and really seeing your child through a clear filter must be very difficult. And I would imagine even more difficult for parents of children with learning disabilities, because we're talking about some potential grief there with each delay or with each sort of expectation that isn't reached. That must be very hard in terms of you saying, well, here's some things you can do. It must seem at times to those parents like it's not enough.
Maybe, but I think at the same time, they have to prioritize their child's emotional needs, and they want that child to end their education feeling good about themselves, feeling self-confident, and yes, they want that child to stretch, they want that child to push himself or herself, And I think a little frustration is really a growth experience. I think, but when frustration becomes so overwhelming that you sink into despondency and you feel that things are futile, then you're not serving that child. So my job, and I guess I should back up and say that I've been an educational diagnostician for 25 years and have evaluated 14,000 children. My job is not to set the limits for what a child is capable of doing. My job is to identify the problems and encourage the child to reach for new goals in increments that are realistic.
That are real.
And interestingly enough, I was on Owen Spann not too long ago, and I was talking about these issues, talking about learning disabilities, and I get a call from this kid, and he said, not a kid, he says, I just took the law boards and have been accepted at Santa Clara University, and I'm going to be going to law school there. And he says, and I was in your program when I was in 3rd grade, and I remember it vividly. And I mean, those kinds of, here is a kid who had serious learning disabilities, and he's going to law school. I have another, a personal friend whose son I worked with, who had serious learning disabilities. He just graduated from the University of California, and he's been accepted in a doctoral program in psychology. So I think that the limit for these kids is that there is no limit. It's just you want to set up the challenges in a progression that they can handle, and that's how they acquire self-confidence, and that's how they learn to feel good about themselves.
Let's take a look at the next set of goals we could strive for. Teaching them to solve problems, which means consider the consequences, analyze the underlying issues, handle stress, deal with anger and frustration, and to prevail in a competitive world, which is to handle temptations, communicate ideas, feelings, and insights effectively, and get the job done efficiently, which is, I felt, was a particularly interesting piece, because so often when I have read these types of materials, they all have sounded very nice in theory. And what was particularly helpful, I think, about your book is that there is an emphasis on how to translate these concepts into real-world usefulness, where children and even older children can see results. They can see something happening when their judgment gets better.
Exactly. And if you can teach a child how to look at a problem and how to understand what the problem is, I mean, even as adults, it's very difficult for us sometimes to get a handle on what a problem is. We deal a lot with the symptoms. I did an experiment in a 5th grade classroom in Cupertino where I was standing in front of this group of kids, and I had a set of keys that I had purposely set on the edge of the table. And it seemed like I inadvertently knocked the keys over. So I picked them up and I put them back in the same place, and I knocked them over about 4 times. Well, by now, all of the kids think this guy is a total turkey. So I said, what's the problem here? And so this was a very bright class, and they said, oh, gravity, or you're not paying attention, or they're too close to the edge. I said, that's not the problem. Those are the causes of the problem. What is the problem? And finally, I was able to elicit from them that the problem was that the keys were falling. And we as adults and teenagers, adolescents, everybody gets caught up in the symptoms of the problem, and it's very, very difficult to get what the problem is. And so once we identified the problem, we defined the problem, the keys were falling, then we identified what was causing it, gravity, inattentiveness, putting it too close to the table, then to the edge, then we brainstormed solutions. And some kids said, put it in your pocket, put it in the center of the table, put it on the floor. So I said, well, we've now brainstormed some solutions, let's select one to try. So one child said, well, why don't you just put it in the center of the table? I said, okay, let's see if it works.
We are going to need to close. I'm sorry, because I would love to spend more time with you. Thank you for being with us tonight, and I want to thank Mr. Green again for joining us. Join us next week as we explore violent men. I'm Mary Crocker Cook. Good night.